The wire bit into the heel of his hand, a familiar pressure that had long ago stopped registering as pain, and he pulled it taut against the warped cedar post, the muscle in his forearm standing out like a knot of old rope. Heat shimmered off the hardpan, making the distant mesas tremble as if they were just a dream of mountains. And the silence was so complete, it had a weight to it, a physical presence that pressed down on a man's shoulders. Elias Thorne worked alone, because the land demanded it and because the town willed it. And he had long ago learned to prefer the company of the sun and the wind to the sideways glances of men who saw only the ruined half of his face. The barbed wire groaned as he twisted the end tight with his pliers, a sound like a dying man's last breath, and the fence was whole again, a thin, sharp line drawn against the vast emptiness of the world. He tested the tension with a gloved thumb. It held. He worked methodically, moving from one broken post to the next, his movements economical and sure, honed by years of solitude and the endless, repeating labor of holding a piece of the world together. The sun beat down on his hat, the sweat tracing clean paths through the dust on his neck, and there was nothing but the work, the heat, and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. He did not think about the fire, not anymore, not during the day when the light was sharp and the world was real, because the day was for work, and work was a kind of prayer that kept the ghosts at bay. He would finish this section of fence by noon, then ride the north pasture to check on the windmill, and then return to the cool, dark quiet of the sod-roofed house he had built with his own 2 hands. It was a life measured in tasks completed, in sunrises and sunsets, a life stripped down to the bone of necessity. He did not ask for more, he did not expect it. The town of Redemption was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better, but for Elias, it was the end of the line, the place where he had stopped running and started mending. He gathered his tools, the metal hot to the touch, and slid them back into the leather roll on his saddle. His horse, a steady buckskin named Dust, shifted its weight but did not stir, accustomed to the long silences and the slow, deliberate pace of its rider. Elias swung himself into the saddle, his body moving with a stiff grace, and he sat for a long moment, surveying the line of mended fence that stretched away until it was just a silver thread stitching the brown earth to the pale blue sky. It was good work. It was enough. Afternoon. The dust on the horizon resolved itself first into a shape, then into a tired horse pulling a rickety wagon, and Elias watched its slow approach from the shade of a lone cottonwood near the creek. Strangers were rare on this road, and those who came usually had the good sense to look like they belonged to the hard country they were crossing. But this wagon was different, listing to one side as if its axle were about to give way, its canvas cover torn and flapping like a wounded bird's wing. He remained still, a habit born of caution, letting the world come to him. As it drew closer, he could see the driver was a woman. Her shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to go deeper than the trail. She handled the reins with a loose grip, her head bowed against the glare, and beside her sat a small child, a pale smudge of a face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He saw the moment the front wheel gave out, the sickening lurch and the sharp crack of old wood that carried easily across the dry air. The wagon sagged, spilling a wooden crate onto the road with a hollow crash, and the horse, startled, shied, and then stood trembling, its head low. The woman did not cry out. She simply pulled back on the reins, bringing the animal to a halt, and sat there for a long time, staring at the broken wheel as if she could not comprehend this final, simple betrayal. Elias nudged Dust with his heels, and the horse moved forward at a walk, its hooves kicking up small puffs of ochre dust. He did not hurry. He approached from the side, so she would see him coming, and stopped a dozen feet away. The woman looked up, her eyes wide and startled in a face smudged with dirt and fatigue. He saw the flicker of fear in them before she masked it. She was young, younger than he had first thought, and there was a fineness to her features that seemed out of place in this raw, sun-scoured land. The child, a little girl with hair the color of straw, pressed herself against her mother's side, her gaze fixed on the scarred side of Elias's face. He was used to that look. He ignored it. He nodded his head once, a curt, small gesture. "Axel's gone," he said, his voice rough from disuse. It was not a question. The woman swallowed, her throat working. "I can see that." Her own voice was quiet, but it held a steady, unbroken note beneath the exhaustion. She did not ask for help. She did not plead or weep. She simply stated the fact. He looked from her to the broken wagon, then to the sun, which was already beginning its slow descent toward the western peaks. Another 2 hours of light, maybe 3. Not enough. He thought of the cool darkness of his house, the solitude he guarded so fiercely, and he felt a familiar resistance tighten in his chest. But he also saw the single water barrel strapped to the side of the wagon, dangerously low, and the pinched, tired face of the child. The land was unforgiving. It did not care about a person's plans. He slid down from his horse. "There's water at my place," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "It's not far. You can stay the night. I'll fix the wheel in the morning." She watched him, her expression unreadable, her gaze moving from his face to his hands, calloused, incapable, and then back again. For a moment, he thought she would refuse, that her fear or her pride would send her down the road on foot, dragging the child with her into the coming dusk. Then she gave a slow, tired nod, as if surrendering to a current too strong to fight. "Thank you," she said. The words were small, but they landed in the immense silence with surprising weight. That night, the woman, Lena, sat at his rough-hewn table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, while her daughter May slept soundly on a cot in the corner, a worn blanket pulled up to her chin. The small house was filled with a quiet it had never known, the soft sound of another person's breathing, the faint scent of soap and road dust. Elias sat across from her, cleaning a piece of harness leather with saddle soap, his movements slow and practiced, his focus entirely on the task. It was easier to look at his hands than at her. He had given them food, a simple stew of jackrabbit and potatoes, and they had eaten with a hunger that was both desperate and polite. Lena had not spoken of where she came from or where she was going, and he had not asked. Questions were a currency he did not trade in. The silence stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. But it was not the hostile silence of the town. It was something different, a shared space of exhaustion and caution. "You built this house yourself," she said, her voice pulling him from his work. He looked up. She was studying the thick sod walls, the smooth, hand-planed timbers of the ceiling. "I did," he answered. "It's solid," she said, as if the word held a deeper meaning for her. "It keeps the heat out and the cold in." "That's a good thing to have." She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes still roaming the small room, taking in the neatly stacked firewood, the clean swept floor, the shelf of worn books. Her gaze was not prying. It was appreciative, as if she understood the language of effort and care. "You have a good piece of land here," she observed quietly. "It's hard land," he corrected, not as a contradiction, but as a statement of fact. "It gives back what you put in, no more." She looked at him then, her gaze direct, and for the first time, she did not flinch from his scars. She seemed to look past them, or through them, to the man sitting behind them. "Most places don't even do that," she said, and the simple finality in her tone told him more than a long story ever could. He went back to his leather, the rhythmic work of his hands a comfort, a wall he could retreat behind. He could feel her watching him, and he wondered what she saw. A monster? A cripple? Or just a man, mending what was broken? He finished the strap and set it aside, the leather now dark and supple. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The child murmured in her sleep. He should have felt invaded, his solitude breached, his carefully constructed peace shattered. Instead, he felt still. The house did not feel smaller with them in it. It felt warmer. "I'll start on that wheel at first light," he said, rising from his chair. "You and the girl can rest." Lena nodded, her eyes full of a weariness that seemed to pull her down into her chair. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Elias," he said, cutting her off. He did not know why he did it. He had not offered his first name to anyone in years. She looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, and then a small, sad smile touched her lips. "Elias," she repeated softly. "Thank you." He just nodded and turned away, moving toward his own small sleeping area, a man retreating into the familiar darkness. Days later, the wheel was fixed, the axle reinforced with a strip of hammered iron, stronger than it had been before. The wagon stood loaded and ready by the gate, but Lena and the child were still there. A fever had taken hold of May the morning they were meant to leave, a sudden, consuming heat that left her limp and breathless. Elias had watched Lena nurse the girl with a fierce, quiet competence, bathing her forehead with cool water, spooning thin broth between her pale lips, her hands never still, her face a mask of determined focus. He had ridden into redemption for medicine, enduring the curious stares at the general store, the questions he refused to answer. He bought quinine and horehound and a small bag of peppermint candy for the girl, an impulse he did not understand and did not examine too closely. The storekeeper, a man named Henderson with watery, inquisitive eyes, had tried to pry. "Got company out at your place, Elias?" Folks saw a wagon. "I've got what I need," Elias had said, his tone flat and final, and he had walked out, leaving the man's curiosity hanging in the dusty air. Now the fever had broken. May sat up on the cot, pale but alert, carefully dressing a small cornhusk doll Lena had made for her. Lena was outside, washing clothes in a large wooden tub, her back to the house. Elias watched her from the doorway, the late afternoon sun catching the stray strands of gold in her hair. She had fallen into a rhythm on the ranch, her presence becoming a quiet fact of his days. She cooked, she mended, she helped him weed the small vegetable garden he kept behind the house, her movements as efficient and purposeful as his own. She did not speak of leaving, and he did not speak of her staying. It was a fragile truce with the future, a thing lived one day at a time. He was sanding a new handle for an old axe, the rasp of the file against the wood a steady, rhythmic sound. He found he no longer sought the absolute silence he had once craved. The small sounds of her presence, the soft hum of her voice as she spoke to May, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, had woven themselves into the fabric of his days. And he found the quiet hollow when she and the girl were asleep. He had spent a long time afterward wondering about that first night, about the choice he had made to offer help. It was not a choice he would have made a year ago. Something had shifted in him, a loosening of a knot he hadn't even known was there. He finished the handle, the wood smooth as bone in his hand, and he looked up again. A rider was approaching, a man on a fine black horse, moving with an air of unearned confidence. Elias recognized him instantly. Silas Croft, the man who owned the bank, the saloon, and half the county. A man who collected debts and deeds the way other men collected stamps, his cruelty always wrapped in a thin veneer of civility. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Croft did not ride out this far for his health. He watched as Croft reined in his horse near the wash tub, dismounting with a proprietary air, as if he were stepping into his own parlor. He saw the way Lena stiffened, her hands stilling in the soapy water, her back ramrod straight. She did not turn to face him. Croft removed his hat, his smile thin and predatory. "Well now, Lena," Croft said, his voice carrying on the still air, "I heard you'd had some trouble. I was beginning to worry." Lena slowly turned, wiping her hands on her apron, her face pale but composed. "There's no need for you to worry, Mr. Croft." "Isn't there?" he said, his eyes sweeping over the small ranch, lingering on the mended wagon, and finally settling on Elias, who stood unmoving in the doorway. Croft's smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. "It seems you found yourself a guardian angel, though I confess I wouldn't have pictured him with wings." Elias said nothing. He let the man's insult hang in the air, a foul smell. He held the axe handle in his hand, his knuckles white. He did not move. He just watched. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the unspoken history between the woman and the man on the fine black horse. Croft took a step closer to Lena, his movements slow and deliberate, the actions of a man who believed the world was his to command. He ignored Elias completely now, as if he were no more than a piece of the landscape, a rock or a weathered post. "You owe me a debt, Lena," Croft said, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "A significant one. Your late husband was not as careful with his finances as he was with your affections." Lena's chin lifted, a small, defiant gesture. "The debt was his. He is gone. Debts have a way of living on," Croft replied smoothly, his gaze drifting pointedly toward the child, who had come to the doorway and was peering out from behind Elias's leg. "They attach themselves to property, to people. I have the papers, all signed and sealed, the smithy, the wagon, everything, including your contract of service." Elias felt the child flinch, her small hand gripping the rough denim of his trousers. A contract of service, indenture. It was another word for slavery. He looked at Lena, and for the first time, he saw the true depth of the fear she had been hiding. A cold, dark terror in the back of her eyes. But her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "That contract is void. It died with him." "A legal opinion? From you?" Croft chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "I assure you the circuit judge will see it my way. He always does. Unless, of course, the debt were to be paid in full, with interest." He let the words hang there, the implication clear. He was not a man who wanted money. He was a man who wanted possession. Elias shifted his weight, the movement small, but it was enough to draw Croft's attention. The man's eyes narrowed, finally acknowledging the silent figure in the doorway. "This is a private matter, Thorne," Croft said, his tone sharpening with irritation. "It has nothing to do with you." Elias thought of the years of solitude, of the walls he had built around himself. He had asked for nothing from the world, and had wanted nothing in return but to be left alone. This was not his fight. This woman was a stranger, her troubles a storm that had blown in from a world he had long since abandoned. He could tell her to leave. He could tell Croft to take her and be done with it. He could close his door and return to the silence, to the familiar and uncomplicated company of his own ghosts. It would be the easy thing to do. It would be the safe thing. He looked down at the small, pale face of the child peeking around his leg, her eyes wide with a fear she was too young to understand. He looked at Lena, standing alone in the harsh sunlight, her dignity a fragile shield against the man who sought to break her. He saw not a stranger, but a reflection of his own stubborn refusal to be erased. He took a step forward, out of the darkness of the house, and into the light, the axe handle held loosely at his side. He stopped beside Lena. He did not look at her. He looked only at Croft. "She's on my land," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "That makes it my business." Croft stared at him, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his features, quickly replaced by contemptuous amusement. "You?" he scoffed. "What are you going to do, Thorne? Frighten me with that face of yours?" He turned his back on Elias, dismissing him again, and focused on Lena. "You have until sundown tomorrow to be off this property and back in town where you belong, or I will come for you, and I will bring the sheriff." He settled his hat back on his head, shot one last, scornful look at Elias, and swung himself onto his horse. "Don't be a fool, Thorne," he said, wheeling the animal around. "She's not worth it." He spurred the horse into a canter, leaving them in a cloud of dust and a ringing silence. The dust settled. Lena stood frozen, her arms wrapped around herself as if holding her body together. She was trembling. Not from fear, Elias realized, but from a rage so profound it had no sound. He stood beside her, a silent sentinel, the axe handle still in his hand, and watched the rider disappear into the shimmering heat. He had not meant to do it. He had not meant to say the words, but they had been said, and now there was no taking them back. That night, the house was quieter than it had ever been. The meal went uneaten. May, sensing the tension that was a living thing in the small room, was subdued, playing silently with her doll before falling into a restless sleep. Lena moved like a ghost, her face a pale, taut mask. She did not look at Elias, did not speak to him. He could feel the weight of her fear, her despair, pressing in on the thick sod walls. He sat by the fire, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, the only sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. He was not a fighter. The fire had taken that out of him, burned away the anger and the pride, leaving behind only the will to endure. But Croft was not a fighter either. He was a bully who used paper and fear as his weapons. He would bring the sheriff, and the law, such as it was in Redemption, would be on his side. A piece of paper with a signature on it held more power than a man's life. Elias set the knife aside, its edge now keen enough to shave with. He looked at Lena, who was staring into the fire, her hands clenched in her lap. "He has papers," she said, her voice hollow. "He'll take her." It was not a question. It was a statement of a future she could already see. Elias did not offer false comfort. He did not tell her it would be all right. The world he knew was not a place where things were always all right. "What was the debt for?" he asked, his voice low. She flinched, as if the question were a physical blow. She was silent for a long time, and he thought she would not answer. "My husband," she finally said, her gaze still fixed on the flames. "He liked to gamble. He thought he could beat Croft at his own game. He borrowed against the smithy, against everything we owned. He signed a contract, for me, in case he couldn't pay with money." She said the words without emotion, a flat recitation of her own sentence. "He died in a card game a week later, a fight. They said he was cheating." Elias listened, the story fitting together with the grim logic of a world run by men like Croft. A man's pride, a bad hand, a woman and child left to pay the price. "The paper is a lie," Elias said. "It was not a guess. How do you know?" she whispered, finally looking at him, her eyes searching his ruined face. "Because men like Croft don't leave things to chance. The debt is real. The contract is not. It's a threat. A tool to make you do what he wants without him having to go through the trouble of the law. But the judge," The judge is in Croft's pocket. It doesn't matter if the paper is real or not. It only matters that people believe it is. He stood up and walked to the small, cracked window, looking out at the night. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky, and the stars were cold and distant. The world was vast and indifferent. A man was small. His choices were all he truly owned. He had spent years making no choices at all, simply reacting, surviving, letting the days pass over him like water over a stone. But now a choice had been made. A line had been drawn. He turned back to her. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making the scars stand out in stark relief. He looked like the monster the town thought he was. "He expects you to run," Elias said. "Or he expects me to throw you out. He doesn't expect a fight." "We can't fight him," Lena said, her voice breaking. "He owns everything." "He doesn't own this land," Elias said, and he stamped his foot on the hard-packed earth of the floor. "He doesn't own me." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes then. Not hope. It was too early for hope. It was something smaller, more fragile, the first stirring of defiance. He walked back to the hearth and picked up the axe handle he had finished that afternoon. The wood was smooth and strong in his hand. "Go to sleep," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Tomorrow, we do not run." He did not know what he would do. He had no plan. He only knew that he would not step back behind the line he had crossed. Not this time. The sun rose hot and white, bleaching the color from the sky. Elias was up before the first light, moving through his morning chores with a deliberate calm that was the eye of a storm. He checked the horses, fed the chickens, and stood for a long time by the fence line, looking toward the town. He was waiting. Lena came out of the house as he was finishing, a cup of coffee in her hand. She looked as if she hadn't slept, but the despair of the previous night was gone, replaced by a brittle, focused resolve. She handed him the cup. Their fingers brushed. A small, simple contact that felt charged with significance. "They will come soon," she said. "I know." He drank the coffee, the hot, bitter liquid, a welcome shock to his system. He could see the dust cloud on the horizon long before he could hear the horses. 3 riders. Croft, as promised, with Sheriff Miller and one of Croft's hired men, a burly man named Jeb. The sheriff was a paunchy, sweating man, whose authority was on loan from whoever paid him best. Today, that was Silas Croft. Elias watched them approach, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching a scene unfold from a great distance. He felt no fear. The fire had burned that out of him too. What was left was a cold, hard certainty. He set down the empty coffee cup on a fence post. "Lena," he said, not looking at her, "take the girl inside. Bar the door." "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will stand with you." He turned to look at her then. She stood straight and tall, her hands clasped in front of her, her face pale but resolute. In her eyes, he saw not a victim, but a partner. He gave a single sharp nod. The riders reined in at the gate, the horses snorting and stamping in the dust. Croft smirked, looking from Elias to Lena and back again. "I see you've made your choice, Thorne. A foolish one." Sheriff Miller dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, a gesture that was more habit than threat. "Elias," he said, his voice wheezing slightly, "Croft here has a legal claim, a writ of repossession for this woman and her property. You're interfering with the law." "There is no law out here, Miller," Elias said calmly. "Only what you're paid to enforce." The sheriff's face reddened. "Now you watch your mouth. I have a warrant." "Show it to me," Elias said. Miller hesitated, glancing at Croft. Croft's smirk tightened. "There's no need for paperwork among neighbors. Lena knows what she owes. Just step aside, Thorne. This doesn't have to get ugly." "It's already ugly," Elias said. He took a step forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Lena. He held no weapon, his hands empty at his sides. He was just a man, standing on his own land. But his stillness was more potent than any threat. It unnerved them. "I'm telling you for the last time," Croft snapped, his patience wearing thin. "Get out of the way." Elias did not move. He did not speak. He just stood there, a rock against which Croft's will was breaking. Jeb, the hired man, shifted in his saddle. "You want I should move him, boss?" Croft nodded, his eyes glittering. "Persuade him." Jeb swung down from his horse, a big man with slow eyes and meaty fists. He cracked his knuckles and started toward Elias. "This is your last chance, old man," Jeb growled. Elias waited until the man was 2 steps away. Then he moved. It was not a flurry of motion, but a single, fluid act. He sidestepped Jeb's clumsy, lunging punch, his body turning with an economy that spoke of something other than ranch work. As Jeb stumbled past, off balance, Elias brought the hardened edge of his hand down in a sharp, brutal chop to the back of the man's neck. Jeb made a sound like a sack of grain splitting open and collapsed face first into the dust. He did not move again. Silence. Croft and the sheriff stared, mouths agape, at the downed man. They had seen a broken rancher. They had not seen a soldier. Elias straightened up, turning his cold, impassive gaze on the sheriff. "You were saying something about a warrant?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Sheriff Miller, his face now the color of ash, took a stumbling step backward, his hand falling away from his pistol, as if it had been burned. Croft's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. He had miscalculated. He had misjudged the man entirely. "This isn't over, Thorne," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "I'll ruin you." "Try," Elias said. The word was a challenge, an invitation. Croft stared at him for a long moment, his mind working, searching for an angle, a weakness. He found none. He saw only the unyielding stillness of a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. With a strangled curse, Croft yanked his horse's head around and galloped away, leaving the sheriff to scramble for his own mount and the hired man to lie unconscious in the dust. Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body sagging with relief. She looked at Elias, at the man who had just stood between her and the end of her world. She saw the scars, the harsh lines of his face, the coldness in his eyes. But for the first time, she did not see a broken man. She saw a fortress. In the quiet aftermath, the world seemed to hold its breath. The dust settled back to earth. The unconscious man groaned and stirred, but made no move to get up. Elias paid him no mind, his attention fixed on the road where Croft had disappeared, as if he could still feel the man's hatred reaching back for him. The tension slowly drained out of him, leaving a profound weariness in its place. He turned and saw Lena watching him, her expression a mixture of awe, gratitude, and something else he couldn't name. Her eyes were on his hands. He looked down and saw that his knuckles were scraped raw where he had struck the man. He hadn't even felt it. "You're hurt," she said, her voice a near whisper. She stepped forward, reaching out as if to touch his hand, then hesitated, her fingers hovering in the air between them. It was a small gesture, but it bridged the vast, silent distance that had separated them. "It's nothing," he said, his voice rough. He curled his hand into a fist, hiding the injury, hiding the part of himself that he had just revealed, the violence he had kept buried for so long. He turned away from her and walked over to the water pump, working the handle with a stiff, jerky motion until water gushed out, cold and clear. He plunged his head and hands into the stream, the shock of the cold a welcome penance, washing away the heat of the confrontation. When he straightened, slicking his wet hair back, she was there beside him, holding a strip of clean white cloth. She did not ask. She simply took his injured hand in hers. Her touch was gentle, her fingers surprisingly strong. He flinched, a reflexive pulling back, but she held firm, her grip conveying a quiet insistence. "Let me," she said softly. He stood rigid as she carefully cleaned the scrapes, her movements deft and sure. He watched her, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way the sunlight caught in her hair. He was acutely aware of the warmth of her skin against his, a sensation so foreign it was almost painful. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, her hand holding his. He had been touched by others since the fire, the clumsy prodding of a doctor, the accidental jostle in a crowded store, but those were collisions. This was a connection. She finished cleaning the wounds and began to wrap the cloth around his knuckles, her touch careful and precise. As she worked, her gaze lifted from his hand to his arm, then to his shoulder, and finally, to his face. Her eyes traced the network of scars on the left side, the tight, pulled skin that the town saw as a mark of monstrosity. He braced himself for the revulsion, the pity, the flicker of fear he always saw in a person's eyes when they looked too closely. But her expression held none of those things. There was only a profound, aching sadness. "It must have hurt," she whispered, her voice thick with an empathy that struck him more deeply than Jeb's fist ever could have. He did not answer. He could not. The words were locked behind years of silence. She finished tying the bandage, her fingers lingering for a moment on his wrist. Then, she did something he would never have expected. She raised his hand to her lips and pressed a soft, gentle kiss to the scarred knuckles. It was not a kiss of passion or of pity. It was a kiss of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of the pain he carried, the the fight he had just fought for her. And then she lifted her other hand and gently, hesitantly, touched the worst of the scars on his cheek. Her fingers were warm. He stood absolutely still. Every muscle in his body tensed, his breath caught in his chest. No one had willingly touched his face in 10 years. Her touch was not a violation. It was a benediction. It did not erase the scar. It accepted it. It honored it. In that one, simple, terrifyingly gentle touch, the walls he had so carefully built around his heart crumbled into dust. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to pull him under. He felt a single, hot tear escape and trace a path through the dust on his good cheek. It was the first tear he had shed since the night of the fire. Weeks later, the rhythm of the ranch had found a new, steadier beat. It was a rhythm for two. The unconscious man had been sent packing with a cracked head and a new respect for quiet men, and Sheriff Miller had not returned. Croft was a shadow in the town, his power diminished by the story that had trickled back. A story of how the broken man at the Thorne place had faced him down without a weapon and won. Power, Elias was learning, was not always a matter of money and influence. Sometimes it was a matter of standing your ground when the world expected you to run. The wagon was still there, parked near the barn, its canvas cover now neatly patched. It was no longer a symbol of a journey interrupted, but of a journey ended. Lena and May were a part of the landscape now, as fixed and as real as the mesas on the horizon. Lena worked beside him, her presence a quiet constant. They repaired the roof of the barn together, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken partnership. She would hold the ladder steady while he climbed, and he would pass down tools without her needing to ask. They rarely spoke, but their silence was no longer born of caution. It was a comfortable shared space, filled with the small sounds of work and life. He found himself watching her, learning the language of her movements, the way she brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, the quiet hum that escaped her lips when she was concentrating on a task, the sudden, brilliant smile she reserved only for her daughter. He was discovering a world he had thought was lost to him forever, a world of small kindnesses and shared burdens. One evening, as the sun set the sky on fire with strokes of orange and purple, they sat on the porch steps, watching May chase fireflies in the growing dusk. A comfortable silence stretched between them. "You never told me," she said, her voice soft in the twilight, "how it happened." She did not have to say what she meant. He looked at his hands, at the bandage she had replaced that morning. He had spent a decade avoiding this question, deflecting it, burying it. He had never told anyone the full story. He had let them invent their own, a tale of carelessness or cowardice. It was easier than the truth. But sitting here beside her, the truth did not feel so heavy. "I was a soldier," he began, his voice low and even. "After the war, I was a ranger. We were tracking a gang of outlaws. They holed up in a cabin, set it on fire to cover their escape. There were people inside, a family." He paused, the memory rising up, thick and choking like smoke. "I went in. I got the mother and the boy out. But when I went back for the father, the roof came down." He fell silent, the story finished. He did not speak of the screaming, the smell of burning pitch and flesh, the suffocating darkness. He did not need to. She understood. She reached over and placed her hand on his, her fingers lacing through his. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say he was a hero. She just held his hand, her presence a silent testament. "The scars don't define you, Elias," she said, her voice full of a conviction that he was only just beginning to feel for himself. "They just show that you survived." He looked at her then, at her strong, kind face illuminated in the fading light, and he felt the last of the ice around his heart finally melt away. He was more than his scars. He was more than his past. He was a man who had been given a second chance. Not to be the man he was before, but to be the man he could be now. He squeezed her hand, a simple pressure, a wordless acknowledgement of everything she had given him. In the distance, May laughed, a sound as clear and bright as a silver bell. And for the first time in a very long time, Elias Thorne smiled. It was a small, stiff thing, a muscle long unused, but it was real. The seasons turned. Summer's fierce heat gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn, and the wind that swept down from the mountains carried the first hint of winter's chill. The ranch thrived under their combined care. The fences were strong, the barn was sound, and a new room had been added to the small sod house, built from the same earth, with the same careful hands. It was May's room, and through its small window, she could watch the sunrise over the eastern plains. The town of Redemption had settled into a new understanding of Elias Thorne. They still kept their distance, but the fear was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. He was no longer the broken monster on the edge of town. He was the man who had stood up to Silas Croft. Croft himself was a diminished figure, his aura of untouchable power fractured. Men who owed him money seemed to stand a little straighter when they spoke to him. His power had always been an illusion built on the fear of others, and Elias had shown them all that the illusion could be broken. Life settled into a new kind of quiet. It was not the empty silence of solitude, but the peaceful quiet of a shared life. It was the sound of 3 people breathing under one roof at night. It was the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the sound of May reading aloud by the fire, her young voice stumbling over the bigger words, and Lena's patient corrections. It was the creak of the porch swing Elias had built, where he and Lena would sit after a long day's work, watching the stars bloom in the vast, dark sky. One afternoon, Elias was in the corral, working with a young colt, a beautiful palomino with a wild streak. He was not breaking the horse, but gentling it, using patience and understanding instead of force. It was a slow process, a conversation built on trust. Lena leaned on the fence, watching him, a small smile on her face. He moved with a quiet confidence, his hands and voice gentle, calming the animal's fear, persuading it that he was not a threat. She saw the same patience he had shown her, the same quiet strength that had given her a place to heal. He finally got the halter on, and the colt stood, trembling but accepting as he stroked its neck. He looked up and saw her there, and the connection that passed between them was as real and as strong as the rope in his hand. That night, a cold wind howled around the house, but inside, it was warm. May was asleep, and the fire crackled in the hearth. Elias was reading one of his worn books, and Lena was mending one of May's dresses. She set her sewing aside and looked at him, at the way the firelight softened the lines of his face, making the scars seem less like damage and more like the grain in a piece of weathered wood. He had given her sanctuary. He had given her safety. He had stood for her when no one else would. He had shown her daughter a kindness she had never known from a man. He had rebuilt her world, and in doing so, he had rebuilt his own. Elias, she said softly. He looked up from his book, his eyes questioning. She came and sat on the floor by his chair, resting her head against his knee, a gesture of comfortable intimacy that would have been unthinkable only months before. He hesitantly placed his hand on her hair, his calloused fingers gentle. "This house," she said, her voice muffled. "It's not just solid, it's a home." He did not answer, but his hand tightened slightly in her hair, and they sat like that for a long time, listening to the wind and the fire, 2 solitary people who had found in each other a place to finally belong. The rancher they said was too broken to love had learned that some things, once shattered, could be put back together, stronger than they were before, and that the deepest scars are not the ones you can see, but the ones you choose to heal together. And so, his story, and hers, became one. Not a story of grand passions or heroic deeds spoken of in town squares, but a quiet story, written in the language of shared work and patient healing. It was a story told in the planting of a garden and the raising of a roof, in the gentle breaking of a horse and the mending of a child's dress. It was the story of how a man who had walled himself off from the world learned to open a door, and how a woman who had lost everything found a place to build anew. The land remained hard, the winters long, and the sun in summer just as fierce. Life was not easy, but it was good. It was real. They had found not a fairy tale ending, but something far more valuable, an ordinary life, earned and shared, a quiet harbor in a world that was often cruel. They had discovered that love is not always a burning fire. Sometimes it is a steady flame in the hearth, a warmth to come home to, a light against the gathering dark. It is the courage to touch someone's scars and the grace to let them touch your own. It is the simple, profound act of standing with someone and saying, with your life, you are not alone. And maybe, in the end, that is the only kind of redemption that truly matters. Thank you for being here, for listening to this story. We all carry scars, don't we? Some on the outside, where the world can see them, and some hidden deep within. It's easy to look at someone's damage and define them by it, to see the brokenness and forget the strength it took to survive. But what if we chose to see something different? What if we looked for the resilience behind the ruin, the courage within the cracks? Every person is a story, far more complex than the one we see at first glance. Think about a time you misjudged someone based on their appearance, or a time someone saw past your own walls to the person you truly were. How did it feel? Let us know your story in the comments below. Your experiences give these tales a life beyond the telling. And if you found a piece of your own heart in Elias and Lena's journey, we hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue to share stories about the quiet strength and hidden dignity that reside in us all. Until next time, be kind to one another and be brave enough to look beyond the scars.